Every skyscraper you've ever photographed exists because of a disaster that happened 150 years ago in Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire, you know? The one supposedly started when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern. Complete fabrication. A reporter literally made it up for clicks, which honestly makes him the world's first viral content creator. But here's the plot twist that would break the internet. What really happened in October 1871 was way more insane than any TikTok conspiracy theory. A 3-day inferno didn't just destroy a city, it accidentally invented the modern world. So there's this Irish immigrant woman named Catherine O'Leary, right? She's running a legitimate dairy business out of her barn on DeKoven Street, making more money than half the men mansplaining entrepreneurship on LinkedIn today. She's working incredibly hard, waking up before dawn to milk cows and deliver fresh dairy to customers, even paying to send her kids to Catholic school when most immigrants couldn't afford such expenses. This woman was basically the 1871 version of a successful entrepreneur, and she had 0 cows kicking over lanterns. But Chicago, in 1871, total fire hazard. Imagine a city built like it was designed by someone who'd never heard of building codes. We're talking wooden everything. Houses, sidewalks, streets, even rooftops covered in tar. It's like if someone decided to build a city entirely out of kindling and then was shocked when it burned down. The city had gone for months with basically no rain, so everything was extremely dry. Even the tar on roofs was literally bubbling in the heat. On October 8th, around 9 p.m., something sparked a fire in O'Leary's barn. Nobody knows what. Maybe someone smoking, maybe kids playing poker, maybe just spontaneous combustion from how ridiculously dry everything was. But here's where it gets absolutely unhinged. The wind turned this little barn fire into nature's own doomsday device. Catherine described it perfectly. The wind blowed every way. You could not tell one way more than the other way. You would hear the roar of the fire like a cannon. This wasn't just a fire. It was like the atmosphere itself was having a breakdown. The flames created these things called fire devils, which are basically fire tornadoes that ripped entire roofs off buildings and hurled them across the city like some demonic game of frisbee. The fire department was completely outgunned. They had 185 firefighters trying to protect 300,000 people with horse-drawn equipment that would look primitive to your local volunteer fire department today. Plus, the fire department had just spent 17 hours fighting another massive fire the night before. So they were already exhausted, and their equipment was damaged. When the alarm went off, the watchman in the courthouse tower completely botched the location and sent the fire trucks to the wrong neighborhood. By the time they figured it out, the fire had a 45-minute head start. And then things got completely apocalyptic. The fire jumped the Chicago River. You know, that thing that was supposed to act like a natural fire break? Wrong. The wind was so intense, it was literally throwing burning debris across the water like nature was playing some twisted game of flaming dodgeball. When the fire hit the gasworks at midnight, the explosion was so massive it plunged the entire city into darkness and added even more fuel to this urban hell. People were running through the streets, carrying whatever random stuff they could grab: pet parakeets, chihuahuas, family Bibles, oil paintings cut out of their frames. Some folks climbed into empty graves in an old cemetery trying to escape the heat. Others stood waist-deep in Lake Michigan for hours, watching their entire world burn behind them. It was like the worst episode of Survivor ever filmed, except nobody was voting anyone off the island. The island was literally on fire. For 3 days, this fire just consumed Chicago relentlessly. By the time it was over, it had destroyed 17,500 buildings across 2,100 acres. 1/3 of the city's population, 100,000 people, were suddenly homeless. The business district, where all the commerce took place, was just gone, vanished. Catherine O'Leary's house somehow survived. But her barn, where the fire started, was obviously destroyed, along with 5 of her 6 cows. Now here's where the story gets really wild. Instead of everyone just sitting around mourning their losses, Chicagoans basically said, "Hold my beer," and started rebuilding immediately. We're talking next-level determination here. Within days of the fire being extinguished, people were setting up businesses in whatever shacks and sheds they could construct. It was like watching a city-sized version of that friend who gets their phone smashed and somehow has a new one within hours. But the really crazy part wasn't just that they rebuilt, it's how they rebuilt. The fire basically became the ultimate teachable moment about what happens when you build everything out of wood. So the city passed laws requiring new construction to use fireproof materials like brick, stone, and limestone. But poor people were like, have you seen the prices on that material? Because obviously fire-resistant materials cost way more than wood. The breakthrough came from this architect named John Van Osdel. There is this legend that when the Palmer House Hotel was about to burn down, he buried the building's blueprints in the basement covered with sand and clay. When he dug them up later and they were perfectly intact, he supposedly had this light bulb moment about terracotta being fireproof. Historians now think this story is mostly made up, but it doesn't matter because the innovation was real. Terracotta, which literally means baked earth, became Chicago's secret weapon. It's basically clay that gets fired at 2,000 degrees until it becomes harder than stone, but lighter than brick. The genius part was that you could mold it into any shape you wanted, so architects could create all kinds of decorative elements while keeping buildings fireproof. Plus, Chicago had tons of local clay, so it was actually economical to mass produce. But the real game changer came when this engineer named William Le Baron Jenney figured out how to build with steel frames. Before this, if you wanted a tall building, you needed massively thick walls at the bottom to support all that weight. Jenney was like, what if we just build a steel skeleton and hang everything else off of it? His home insurance building, finished in 1885, was the first skyscraper to use steel framing instead of iron or masonry. Think about how revolutionary this was. Instead of buildings being like solid blocks of stone, they became more like your laptop, a strong internal frame with a thin, lightweight exterior. This meant you could build way taller, have bigger windows, and create more flexible interior spaces. It was basically the difference between carrying a Nokia brick phone and an iPhone. The combination of steel frames and terracotta cladding created what became known as the Chicago School of Architecture. These buildings had this distinctive look: large windows arranged in grids, minimal decoration, and this earthy red and cream color from the terracotta. The architects weren't trying to copy some European cathedral. They were creating something totally new and American. One of the most impressive innovations was the Chicago window, a three-part design with a big fixed window in the middle, and two smaller windows that could open on the sides. This design maximized natural light while still allowing ventilation, and it became standard in commercial buildings worldwide. You've probably seen thousands of these windows without even realizing they had a name. But here's where it gets really interesting. The fire didn't just change how they built, it changed when they built. The Montauk Building was the first in the world to be constructed at night using electric lighting. Imagine explaining that to someone in 1871. Yeah, we're just gonna work all night using artificial illumination. Construction could now happen 24/7, which meant Chicago could rebuild incredibly fast. The speed of reconstruction was honestly mind-blowing. Between 1872 and 1879, the city issued over 10,000 building permits. Sometimes, construction started before architects had even finished the designs. It was like watching a city-sized 3D printer just cranking out buildings non-stop. Within 20 years, Chicago's population exploded from 300,000 to over 1 million people. But there was a troubling side to all this innovation. The new building codes essentially created a two-tier city. Wealthy areas got fireproof steel and terracotta buildings, while poor neighborhoods continued using wood construction because that's all people could afford. The city eventually grandfathered existing wooden buildings and allowed wood construction outside the fire zone, which meant the safety improvements mostly benefited people who already had money. Meanwhile, Catherine O'Leary got absolutely mistreated by history. Even though official investigations completely cleared her of any wrongdoing, newspapers kept blaming her for the fire. They published fake interviews and doctored photos, making her look like some kind of witch. She became a recluse, only leaving her house to go to church. When she died in 1895, people literally vandalized her grave and left garbage there. It took until 1997, over a century later, for the Chicago City Council to officially clear her name. The technological innovations that came out of Chicago's rebuilding didn't stay in Chicago. When San Francisco got hit by an earthquake and fire in 1906, they discovered that steel-framed buildings with terracotta cladding survived way better than traditional masonry. This led to steel frame construction becoming the global standard for urban buildings. What's really remarkable is how many of these innovations happened simultaneously. Steel manufacturing had just become economical thanks to the Bessemer process. Elevator technology was advancing rapidly because obviously you can't build skyscrapers without elevators. Electric lighting was becoming practical for construction work. It was like all these technologies hit their stride at exactly the right moment to rebuild Chicago. The architects leading this revolution were mostly young professionals who saw the fire as an opportunity rather than a disaster. Louis Sullivan, who coined the phrase "form follows function," believed skyscrapers could express American democratic ideals by soaring upward without all the hierarchical symbolism of European architecture. He and his partner, Dankmar Adler, created buildings that were both technologically advanced and artistically significant. There were some unintended consequences, though. Early steel frame buildings sometimes had problems with thermal expansion. Turns out steel expands and contracts with temperature changes. Who knew? Foundation issues were another headache because Chicago is basically built on swampland. And nobody really understood wind loads on tall buildings yet, which led to some concerning moments. The fire also changed urban planning in ways that still affect Chicago today. All the debris got dumped into Lake Michigan, which created part of what's now Grant Park. The need to rebuild quickly led to better street layouts and improved water systems. Building codes became innovation drivers rather than obstacles when the city required all buildings over 90 feet to be fireproof. It created a market that pushed technological development even faster. What made Chicago's response so unique was this attitude of, if there's a problem, solve it and move on. They didn't sit around debating whether to rebuild or trying to recreate exactly what existed before. They saw the fire as a chance to build something better. It was innovation through destruction. Sometimes you have to break things completely before you can rebuild them properly. The materials science advances went way beyond architecture. The demand for fireproof construction accelerated research into fire-resistant iron alloys, improved concrete, advanced mortar, heat-resistant glass, and better insulation materials. These innovations had applications in industrial and infrastructure construction that extended far beyond buildings. Today, every skyscraper from New York to Dubai traces its technological DNA back to those innovations born from Chicago's ashes. The steel frame construction, curtain wall systems, and integration of mechanical systems that define modern urban architecture all started with architects and engineers trying to solve the problems revealed by the Great Chicago Fire. The economic impact was massive too. Chicago's location as a railroad hub meant most of its major industries, the stockyards, lumber yards, and railroad infrastructure, survived the fire. This provided the economic foundation to fund all this innovation. The construction boom created huge demand for new building materials, making Chicago a center for steel production and construction equipment manufacturing. What's probably the most important lesson from Chicago's story is that innovation often requires destroying old assumptions. The fire didn't just burn down buildings, it burned down ideas about how cities should be built. Everyone assumed you needed thick masonry walls for tall buildings until steel frames proved otherwise. Everyone thought decoration had to be carved stone until terracotta made molded ornamentation possible. Looking back, the Great Chicago Fire was like a massive software update for urban civilization. It forced an upgrade from Wood City 1.0 to Steel City 2.0. The technologies developed during those desperate years between 1871 and 1885 became the foundation for modern urban life. Every time you ride an elevator in a glass tower, walk past a building with large windows, or live in a city with proper building codes, you're experiencing innovations that trace back to Chicago's rebuilding. The fire teaches us something crucial about how change really happens. Sometimes incremental improvement isn't enough. Sometimes you need complete disruption to reveal new possibilities. Chicago didn't just rebuild, it reimagined what a city could be. They took the worst urban disaster in American history and turned it into the birth of the modern city. The next time you walk through any modern city, remember that you're navigating the legacy of Catherine O'Leary's barn fire. Every steel beam reaching toward the sky, every wall of windows flooding offices with light, every building that stands fireproof and tall. They all trace back to the 3 October days, when Chicago burned and humanity learned to build differently. The greatest innovations don't come from boardrooms or labs. They come from the ashes of what we thought was impossible to lose.